This Amtrak train runs between Chicago and Detroit, but to make it even better, some trains shouldn't be going to Chicago at all. Let me explain. The Wolverine is one of Amtrak's fastest trains outside of the Northeast. With a top speed of 110 miles per hour, or 177 kilometers per hour, it connects Chicago, Illinois with Pontiac, Michigan, with important intermediate stops like Kalamazoo, Ann Arbor, and of course, Detroit. The Wolverine runs 3 times a day in both directions, and it gets its funding from the state of Michigan, together with the Pere Marquette and the Blue Water. And today, we're going to talk about how to make it even better. We ask ourselves, what would an ideal service look like? It's a follow-up to a video that I released in October, where we took the same approach to the Northeast Regional. Now, in the current political climate, that may seem a little bit silly to talk about ideal train service. Shouldn't we be more concerned about preserving what we have? And yes, but I don't think that's mutually exclusive. I think that you need a certain level of idealism. You need to know what the best case scenario would be to be able to advocate effectively. Anyway, why did I choose the Wolverine for this follow-up? Well, 2 reasons actually. Objectively, the Wolverine is a great candidate for improvement because it's already a good service. Let me explain. The Wolverine has an advantage that most Amtrak trains outside of the Northeast don't. For a long stretch, it runs on tracks owned by Amtrak or the state of Michigan. See, most Amtrak trains run on tracks owned by private freight companies. On the day-to-day operations side, this means that trains can get stuck behind long, slow freight trains. But on the planning side, there's also a disadvantage. It takes a lot of politics to get a private company on board with more passenger service on their lines. Oftentimes, new tracks and sidings will be built for the company, but at the taxpayer's expense. Amtrak owns the route of the Wolverine between Porter, Indiana and Kalamazoo, Michigan, while the Michigan Department of Transportation owns the line from Kalamazoo to Dearborn, except for a short section in Battle Creek. Not only do the Amtrak trains not get stuck behind freight trains quite as much, but it is so much easier for necessary infrastructure projects to happen. Not easy, but easier. For example, right now there's a construction project to double track several miles around Niles, Michigan. And in 2011, Norfolk Southern still owned the eastern half of the line, and they wanted to degrade it to be 40-mile-per-hour track. But when Michigan bought it, they were able to perform the work to get it up to 110 miles per hour. There are also personal reasons for me selecting this route. After the Northeast Regional, I think the Wolverine is the Amtrak train that I've been on the most. Many of you know that I lived in Grand Rapids for 4 years, and at first, I did my trips to Chicago on the Pere Marquette, which is a really nice train. It'll always have a special place in my heart. But with just one early morning departure every day, it wasn't ideal. Slowly, I discovered that if I drove down to Kalamazoo and took the Wolverine, it was often cheaper and faster. Plus, with 3 daily departures, and a 4th if you count the Blue Water, I could leave in the morning, afternoon, or evening. So the Wolverine became my regular connection between West Michigan and Chicago. So without further ado, what can we improve? Today, we will first talk about 4 main improvements: punctuality, frequency, stopping patterns, and range. Then I will briefly discuss some minor improvements, such as potential branches, station location in Detroit, service to Canada. I also thought about including electrification. And yes, if any line would be a candidate for electrification, it would probably be the Wolverine. I would strongly support it, but bearing in mind that I said I would stick to service, that's all I'm going to say about that for now. On to punctuality. Didn't I just say that the Wolverine can avoid freight delays because Amtrak owns the Michigan line? Yes, that is true. Of all the times I've been on the Wolverine, only once did we ever get delayed in Michigan. But Indiana? That's a whole different story. From Porter to Chicago, the Wolverine runs on the infamous Norfolk Southern Chicago line. This super busy railroad crosses the vast industrial zone known as the Indiana Harbor, and is notorious for the egregious delays that Amtrak trains can rack up on it. It's so bad, whenever we would pull into Chicago on time, it actually felt notable. If only there was a way to avoid the Chicago line. Turns out, there is. Running parallel to the Wolverine all the way from Chicago to Michigan City, which is in Indiana, is the fully electrified, mostly double-track South Shore Line. The South Shore Line has some freight service, but it exists primarily for passenger trains. Running the Amtrak Michigan trains on the South Shore Line would reduce so many bottlenecks. It would do wonders for their on-time performance. Now, the idea is not as outrageous as it might sound. In 2022, Amtrak applied for federal money to support their Chicago Hub Improvement Program, also known as CHIP. Part of CHIP was a new ramp immediately south of Union Station that would essentially enable Amtrak trains to eventually reach the South Shore Line. In 2024, Amtrak was granted some of the money they applied for. For example, the double track I mentioned that they're laying in Niles is funded by this. The ramp remains unfunded, but the whole idea is on Amtrak's radar. As for frequency, there's not really that much to say. 3 times a day is pretty good for Amtrak, but it definitely could be better. Detroit, Dearborn, Ann Arbor, Kalamazoo all have large populations, not to mention their suburbs. But more than that, they all have huge student populations. The Wolverine serves a bunch of Michigan's most famous universities, and students are statistically less likely to own cars. All that to say, eventually, I think you could easily get an hourly train filled. I've never been on a Wolverine that wasn't packed. More important though, and this is kind of the crux of the whole video, is where these trains run. The Wolverine is funded by the state of Michigan. Currently, all 3 trains run to and from Chicago, which makes sense. Chicago is by far the largest city in the Midwest. It offers numerous connections to other trains, but shouldn't a Michigan train also serve the people of Michigan? I would argue that right now, it doesn't fully. The first Wolverine of the day, number 350, leaves Chicago at 6:45 a.m. That's a reasonable time to run a morning train. But on its way to Michigan, it crosses into a new time zone. Between the run time and the time change, by the time it reaches New Buffalo, the first stop in Michigan, it's already 9 a.m. Kalamazoo is served at 10:14, and Detroit isn't reached until 1:25 in the afternoon. That's the first train of the day. So what that means is that there is no way for someone in Michigan to take the train and get to Detroit in the morning. Even though the time from Kalamazoo to Detroit is only 3 hours, your earliest option is getting there after lunch. It's a little bit better on the way back. The 355 leaves Detroit at 6:11 to get into Chicago at 10:40. Still though, let's say you want to get dinner in the city, or watch the Lions or the Tigers play an evening game before you go home. The train's just not an option. And the solution for this problem is super simple. Not all trains have to go to Chicago. In the morning, some trains should originate at New Buffalo, or even Kalamazoo. And in the evening, some trains should terminate there. A 5 a.m. departure from New Buffalo would get into Detroit by 9:30. A 9 p.m. train from Detroit would make it to Kalamazoo before midnight. By doing this, you would instantly make the Wolverine so much more useful for so many more Michiganders. Another thing that's important to me is regular stopping patterns. I've discussed this in my Northeast Regional video before, but right now the 3 Wolverine trains all stop at different stops. Kalamazoo is served by all the trains, but Albion only by one of them, Niles and Dowagiac by 2. It's a little messy. I strongly believe that a train's name should not only say something about where it's going, but also about where it stops. So I would propose having a fast and a slow service. The fast service could keep the Wolverine name and only stop at New Buffalo, Kalamazoo, Battle Creek, Ann Arbor, Dearborn, and Detroit. While the slower service, let's call it the Robin after the Michigan State bird, would stop at all stops. Alternate between the 2, or run 2 Wolverines for every 1 Robin. It's just a simple thing that makes taking the train easier to understand for more people. Moving on to the next potential improvement, we could add a branch from Kalamazoo to Grand Rapids. The Grand Elk Railroad connects these 2 cities, but I do think the tracks of the Grand Elk are in really bad shape. It would take a lot of work to get them up to passenger train standards. This is really just something selfish. I want a train that runs this route. Although, when you think about it, it is pretty wild that there are absolutely 0 plans, not even concepts of a plan, to connect Detroit with GR, the state's 2 largest cities separated by a distance that's just perfect for rail travel. More important would be a branch to Toledo. This connection existed with the Amtrak Lake Cities train until 1995, when the Lake Cities was rerouted to Pontiac. People in Michigan should not have to backtrack all the way to Chicago to take the train east. The good news is that in 2023, they did receive a grant to continue a study on running the train from Pontiac to Cleveland, with a stop at the Detroit airport and, of course, Toledo. Now let's talk about Canada. As you may know, Detroit is just across the river from Windsor, Ontario. In fact, the original Wolverine train, run by the Michigan Central Railroad, connected Chicago and New York via Detroit and Southern Ontario. The same grant that I mentioned earlier will also allow Amtrak to divert one train from Detroit into Windsor, crossing underneath the river. After going through border facilities, passengers would then get on a Via Rail train to Toronto. I know the relationship between the US and Canada is rocky right now. I'm getting a lot of the same comments under my Maple Leaf video, but I'm trying to be optimistic that things will get better someday, and can't think of a corridor where an international train would be more useful than the Chicago-Detroit-Toronto corridor, with how many major and medium-sized cities are along the way. For a train to reach Canada, it cannot use the current Detroit station. It would have to use the old Michigan Central station. This beautiful building was recently restored by the Ford Motor Company, and there are provisions to build a modern train platform for any potential future train service here. A train to Windsor would have to use that location because the current Detroit station is in a different part of town. And talk about modest, it's just an Amshack. So here's where I come to a point where I don't quite know what to recommend, and maybe my viewers can help me with this. Both stations have advantages. The Michigan Central station is closer to downtown and is just a much more appealing place, but the existing Detroit Amtrak station is directly connected to the Q-Line streetcar into downtown, and allows trains to go to Royal Oak, Troy, and Pontiac. Now, in an initial draft of this video, I had recommended to sever the Pontiac branch from the Wolverine, and the reason I did that was because I didn't think it was useful to have an intercity service become a commuter train. But then I did some digging and found the Amtrak ridership statistics, and it turns out most passengers getting on at these three stops are going beyond Detroit. So the Wolverine should keep serving Pontiac, although I would highly recommend there be commuter train service from Ann Arbor to Pontiac. I know commuter trains have had a rough history in Michigan. I mean, that's worth its own video. But still, I think it would be very beneficial to have that on top of the Wolverine. But it raises the question, if Wolverine trains are going to go to Windsor and to Pontiac, where should the Detroit station be? I mean, ideally there would just be one location, but that may not be possible. Anyways, those are my recommendations on how to make the Wolverine, which is currently definitely Michigan's best train, an even better train. Most importantly, run some services that stay within the state of Michigan, increase the frequency, get rid of choke points where delays can happen, simplify the schedule, and Michigan could have its own world-class train. Have you been on the Wolverine? What would you like to see change? If anybody wants to do a similar exercise like this about a train that's important to you, feel free to do so. Reach out to me either via email, via Instagram, or in a comment, and I would love to take a look at it. Thank you so much for watching today. If you enjoyed this, please subscribe to Trains Are Awesome. We'll see you next time.